Video games based on films are a rare occurrence these days. As video game development costs have risen, more and more movie studios are considering video game tie-ins as a massive financial risk. Back in the 90s and early 2000s, however, this was not the case, and games based on movie franchises were a dime a dozen. Practically every popular movie franchise you could think of had a video game adaptation of some sort. Despite not being nearly as popular today, the Terminator franchise was massive back in the early 90s, and it was inevitable that video games would follow. Unlike many other movie franchises from the 90s, however, there were actually a handful of genuinely great Terminator games. But there were also many Terminator titles that will go down in history as some of the worst games of all time. Okay, yeah, so the gameplay is pretty bad in this game, but check this out. The motorcycle is covering Arnold's stick. I like that. This game is great. I don't get why everyone hates it. I was planning on covering all Terminator games for this video, but I got bored about 5 minutes later, so I decided just to cover two of my favourites, the Terminator on Sega Genesis and Sega CD. Both these games are based on the first film in the Terminator franchise, which is strange because the sequel had been out for over a year by the time these games were released. The Terminator on Sega Genesis was developed by Probe Entertainment and published by Virgin Interactive. Its gameplay is very reminiscent of many popular run-and-gun shooters from the time, like Contra or Gunstar Heroes. Just not as good. The game begins with a strong opening level, which requires you to blow your way through dozens of Terminators, before planting a bomb beside a reactor and escaping the area before you're blown sky high. This first level alone has more ideas in it than the rest of the game combined. It starts with an intimidating mini-boss that you have to defeat with crappy grenades. Shortly afterwards there's a hidden area that contains a laser gun that makes your life a whole lot easier, and the level ends with you running for the exit while the timer counts down. It reminds me a lot of the reactor sequence from Final Fantasy VII actually. Unfortunately, the rest of the game is very unimaginative. The second level takes place in 1984 and tasks you with reaching the Tech Noir bar without being killed by the criminals and cops roaming the streets. This level is entirely linear and it's almost impossible to die since enemies are easy to kill and frequently drop health pickups. Once you reach Tech Noir, however, shit gets real. Remember that incredible shootout from the film that took place in this bar? Well, it's recreated perfectly in the game. The third level takes place in the police station from the film. Unfortunately, it plays exactly the same as the previous level. Just run and gun until you reach Sarah. The next level is the final stage in the game, and tasks you with leading the T-800 to Sarah, who then finishes it off by crushing it. This last level is annoying as shit and required several attempts before I was able to successfully beat it. This place is a maze and a single wrong turn will probably result in your death, which wouldn't be a problem except for the fact that you only have a single goddamn life to complete the entire game. Why did the developers think it was okay to force the player to constantly replay the entire game over and over again every time they died? Surely it wasn't because the game is only 15 minutes long and they wanted to artificially pad out the length of the game? Nah, that couldn't be it. You know, as much as we all complain about how greedy game companies are today, this is just taking the piss. Could you imagine this game being released today? Imagine walking into GameStop and purchasing the Terminator on Sega Genesis for $60 and then returning to the store half an hour later to trade the game back in, and then only receiving $15 store credit for it, knowing GameStop. I don't think the Terminator on Sega Genesis is a terrible game. I actually had a lot of fun with it. The gameplay is enjoyable and the music is awesome. But it is ridiculously short and I'm honestly struggling to think of many games that are shorter than this one. If you're planning on purchasing the game online, I wouldn't recommend spending any more than a few bucks on it. There just isn't enough content here to warrant a purchase. So since the Genesis game turned out to be a little disappointing, many would probably assume that the Sega CD version is even worse. It's not. It's fucking incredible. I'm tempted to say that the Terminator on Sega CD is easily the greatest Terminator game ever made, but I don't want to make that kind of statement just yet, because Terminator Resistance is out Friday, and it's also in with a shot of becoming the greatest Terminator game ever made. Oh hey, this looks really good. I wonder who developed it. Teon. Where have I heard that name before? Well, let's have a look at their portfolio and see what other games they've developed. So Terminator on the Sega CD is easily the greatest Terminator game ever made. It might even be one of my favourite 16-bit games ever. Everything about the game is polished to a mere sheen. The graphics are stunning, the levels are expertly designed, the gameplay is fun as hell, and that soundtrack. Oh god, that soundtrack. The fucking legend that is Tommy Tallarico composed this beast of a soundtrack, and I swear to God, it's pretty much all I've been listening to this entire week. Unlike the Genesis game, the Terminator on Sega CD is actually a pretty lengthy title, and has a fair bit of replay value too, since there are optional routes and hidden areas to find everywhere you look. There are also lives, thank Christ, and you'll need them too, because this is a really challenging game, but not in a "oh you died? Fuck you, back to the start of the game" kind of way. It's tough but never unfair. I love it. I also have to quickly mention the FMV cutscenes because they're hilariously awful. So between levels you're treated to actual scenes from the film, but they look awful and run at a terrible frame rate. I honestly don't know why they bothered, especially since, like I said earlier, the film had been out for nearly a decade by the time this game released, so anyone who really wanted to see the film would have done so ages ago. Other complaints I have are minor, like shooting on ladders being a little fiddly at times. Also, I know this is a weird complaint to have about an action game, but there seems to be too many enemies at times. Like, you might as well keep your finger held down on the fire button at all times, because you're never really given a break from the constant onslaught of enemies. Aside from those small nitpicks, however, this is easily one of the greatest games on the Sega CD, right up there with Sonic CD. So that's my review of the Terminator on Sega Genesis and Sega CD. Not a bad pair of games, all things considered. The Genesis game is definitely the weaker of the two, but there's still fun to be found with it. The Sega CD game, however, is the real deal, and is a must-buy for anyone with the system. Anyways, I'd like to thank you beautiful people for watching, and I'll see you soon.